Hey there, and welcome to the third episode of my video series on how to create, release, and automate releases for GitHub Actions. In this third episode, we are going to automate the release that we previously did in episode 2 by hand. So if you didn't watch the previous 2 episodes, I encourage you to use those. If you just want to learn how to automate GitHub Action releases, you'll probably be able to follow along with this video as well. So there are numerous ways on how you can actually automate GitHub Action releases. You can write an entirety of scripts on your own that do the job for you. So the jobs are, of course, building it, pushing it to the repository, finding the right version, updating it, releasing it. You can search for actions on the marketplace that are out there that will do the job for you. Or, and this is my preferred way of doing it, you can use the tool Semantic Release. Semantic Release is a super good tool that actually helps you to release any kind of package, not just actions. It relies heavily on semantic versioning, and we've talked about semantic versioning in the previous episode. And just to give you a really quick introduction again, because this is important to understand Semantic Release. Let's have a look at the version that we just released in the last episode. It was the version 1.0.0, and this is what Semantic Release is all about. You always have 3 digits, and depending on the digit that gets raised during an upgrade or during a release, this kind of indicates to the users of your package what kind of change they have to expect. The name for the 3-digit is major, minor, and patch, or as I'd like to call them, and this also kind of like confines with the naming Semantic Release chooses, it's breaking change, added feature, or a fix of a bug or a security vulnerability. And this kind of already explains what the versions are all about. So for the major version or the breaking version, if your API of what you are releasing changes, if the behavior changes of your application to what it previously was, you have to increment this version and let your users know, hey, you cannot use my package the same way as you've used it before. For a simple example in an action, if you add a new input that is required to be there, then it is a breaking change, because users that currently use your action cannot simply upgrade because they have to specify this new input while they are upgrading. If you are, for example, just adding a new feature and the input is not required and your action works the same way as before, but it has a new feature now, then you increment the feature version and indicate to your users that, well, there is new functionality here. You don't have to use it, but you can. And last but not least, the fix version is if you fix a bug, if their behavior of application is not as intended, or if you have a security vulnerability that you need to fix. As long as the behavior of your application or your release or your action or whatever does not change, this is a fix update. So Semantic Release builds on that, and it actually automates finding out which version you have to update by making you or enforcing, and this is the second bullet point here, enforcing semantic versioning through commit messages. And if you've watched the previous 2 videos, you might have realized that I always prefix my commit messages. Let's have a look. If we go into all the commits, 6, you see that I have always added feat for feature or chore if there was just some little minor maintenance. And this is exactly the kind of format that Semantic Release expects. And depending on what you've put in front of your commit messages, it will be able to determine if this is a fix release, a feature release, or a breaking release. The format actually comes from AngularJS, and I'm going to put the link, of course, of this documentation into the description, but this is basically the document describing this kind of format. You always have a type. This is the feat build CI. It's explained down here. It can be anything, indicating what this commit is actually changing in your code base. You can, but you don't have to use a scope. I usually don't use this because for me this just adds overhead and no real value, especially in actions. But in larger application, it might make sense to also add a scope. And then you give the short summary. This is your usual commit message that you give. And Semantic Release now comes in and kind of analyzes all the commits since the last release. And depending on the highest value of type, it will then increment the version for you automatically. So if we have a look again into the commits I've been doing, if we had a release now, our very first release, Semantic Release would now realize that I added features, so it would increment the feature, the middle version for me of my version tag. But this is not all that Semantic Release does. Semantic Release relies heavily on a plugin system that will also do stuff like, well, commit build files. It will create tags on Git. It will create releases on GitHub for us. So it basically covers everything that we are required to do in order for us to release our GitHub Actions package. But before I talk more about theory, let's just dive in and do it, because I think that explains best how it works. So let's go back into our code. And the first thing that we have to do is, of course, install Semantic Release. So we are going to install Semantic Release. And I'm also going to go ahead and install 2 plugins, which I know of that we are requiring them. One of them being Git, and the other one is going to be GitHub. And we install all of this as a dev dependency, because this is no production required value of our actual application, but only required during build time. And while we're installing all this kind of things, let's go to the next thing that we have to do. We have to configure Semantic Release. And configuration is done a little bit like GitHub Actions, in that you create a file on the root of your repository, you name it releaseconfig.js, and into this config you put the configuration of Semantic Release. I went ahead and created this in advance, so I don't have to type it all down. As you can see, it's quite sophisticated, but let's go through it step by step. First of all, we are telling Semantic Release that we only want releases on our main branch. This is makes a lot of sense, because we don't have a Git flow or anything. It's really just a simple action. So the main branch suffices for releasing stuff. You can configure pre-releases, branches for pre-releases or dev releases. You have all these possibilities here, but I'm not going to go into detail here. It would just, I could talk about hours for what you can achieve with this configuration. But let's keep it simple for now. And then, as you can see, we're already going over to the plugins that we want to use. First of all, the commit analyzer. The commit analyzer does exactly what I was explaining before. It will look at all the commits and all the commit messages since the last release, or since the start of the repository if there was no previous release. And it will kind of do 2 things. It will increment the version for us according to the release prefixes that it found. And it will also kind of give these commits to plugins that come later down in this configuration. And this is important for the second plugin that we are using the release nodes generator. This release nodes generator will then take these commits that the commit analyzer provided for it, and it will put them into a nice little markdown string that we then later can attach in the GitHub step onto our release. How this looks like we're going to see in a bit, but basically it will list all our commit messages in the release, which is super cool because you get a release node out of the box. And if you kind of take care of nice commit messages, which I really encourage you to do, you don't need to create any changelog and release nodes manually anymore, but you let your commit messages speak for you. And this, as a little excursus, is actually why I love Semantic Release so much and why I love using it so much, because it takes cognitive load out of the release process and shifts it into when I'm actually doing the changes. And I'm doing the changes when I commit something or when I open a pull request. I know best, while I open the pull request, what kind of change it is and how to best describe and document this change. If I'm doing a release like 2 months after I created a commit, I have to go back and understand again what this commit was all about. With Semantic Release, I already document the commit while I do it, so it takes a lot of load off my releases. Let's go further down. We have the Semantic Release Git plugin that we've just installed, and this plugin actually takes assets, as we see here in the second line of the configuration, and it will stage, commit, and push them to our repository. One little caveat, of course, we have to build those assets before, but this is something that we are going to handle in our release workflow, which we are going to develop in a little bit. We can also give the git commit our own message here. So this is the default value I've taken from the documentation of this plugin. It confines to the commit message format here by saying this is just a jar. It doesn't add any feature, the release in itself. It's just a jar of pushing up the build files. And it also has something interesting in here. They skip CI statement. This indicates to GitHub that with this commit, it's not supposed to trigger any workflows that are usually triggered by push events. And this is important because if you automate the releases to a point that on any push to a main branch, for example, semantic release is triggered, you would go in an endless loop if the build and the pushing during the build would trigger another release. And so we avoid those kind of scenarios by the skip CI statement, which GitHub understands. And last but not least, we use the Semantic Release GitHub plugin, and this plugin also does two things. First of all, it creates the release in itself, and as previously stated, it kind of puts the release node into the release and also creates the tag with the correct version for us. But it will do another cool thing in that it goes to all pull requests that are part of this release or that contributed a commit to this release and post a little comment there in that this pull request was now released. And this is super cool for open source actions where you have a lot of contributors, and it's a nice gesture of letting them know once the changes that they contributed to your repository are released and in which version they are actually released. And it kind of also adds a little bit of a traceability to your pull requests, which I think is pretty nice. That's all we require from a configuration point of view. Now we actually need to trigger semantic release somehow, and we do this, of course, through a GitHub workflow. And for this, we basically just commit what we already have in our test workflow. We name it release. We're also going here, name this release, and we're going 6 down, and we also name this release. And what we can remove is all the testing things, because during the release we should have done our testing already, so we don't need to remove node modules and test our action. But what we need to add is a command that is npx semantic release. Now npx triggers binaries that are in our node modules, and by installing semantic release, it will place a binary into the modules that will, execute semantic release. However, for semantic release to properly function, it needs some permissions. It needs the permissions to push to the repository, as it will push the build files. And it also requires the permission to comment on pull requests and issues. And for this, we have to give it those permissions. And we can do this in 2 steps. First of all, we actually have to give the permissions to the job in itself. And we can do this in GitHub Actions by, specifying permissions and then using, and Copilot already suggests it for me, contents write, which will allow this action to, push to GitHub. But we also give it the issues write and the pull request write permissions. On default, GitHub Actions are only allowed to read, but with these permissions, we now give it the permission to write. And we have to pass these permissions now also to the npx semantic release command somehow. And we do this through the GitHub token environment variable. GitHub token is the name. And we can just use the secrets.github token, which comes out of the box with any GitHub action. So the permissions that we defined here are automatically attached to the token that GitHub Actions or the workflow will create for us. And we then give this token to the semantic release command, and then it can use all those permissions. Now, before we advance, I'm going to change one little thing here. I'm going to change the event that triggers our workflow from push to workflow dispatch. This is what I personally usually do for a single reason. I don't want to release on every commit I put to the main branch. I sometimes want to group commits. Sometimes if it's just a fix, I don't want to just go ahead and release a version immediately, because releasing a version always means for people that use my actions that they have to update, right? I mean, there's Dependabot, but I try to not give them too much work, especially if it's not really worth it, if it's not a security related thing. I sometimes just wait for a few commits or a few changes to pile up before I actually bring out a release, and therefore I usually release manually. In the end, it's just, you know, one click from me and the rest is still automated. So that does not defy the automating purposes for me. If you want to release on any push, feel free to do so. Also, in terms of this demo, it's maybe better if we do it manually so you actually see what is going on. And one last thing that I'm going to do is I am going to change the test workflow to only run on pull requests to our main branch, as this also kind of like confines to a normal open source project process where you do all the testing once a pull request is created. And once it gets merged to main, you do your release. Of course, you could also do it on both events, you know, on a pull request and on a push to main. But let's save some action minutes here, save the environment, and not test it because we tested it thoroughly on the pull request already. So we are kind of ready to push all the changes out, and we're going to say this is a CI change because all we did right now was changing our CI system, right? So it's neither a fix nor a feature nor a breaking change. So we are going to say add semantic release. But now actually we don't, since the last release that we did manually, we don't have any changes that would trigger another release. So let's also fake a breaking change now, so you kind of see how a breaking change would look like. And let's do this by being very simple here. It's not strictly a breaking change maybe, but let's treat it as such that we change the welcoming message from hello to welcome. And we are kind of staging this thing. And now a breaking change is not, as you might expect, that you put breaking in here or anything. It is still either a fix or a feature. So you still go with feed changes welcome message, but you do another thing in that you put the description and the breaking change comment down here in the commit message separated with 2 line breaks. And the reason for this is that a breaking change is not a breaking change in itself, but usually comes with a feature or a fix, right? So you still kind of have the semantics of if this breaking change came from one or the other. Also, what it allows you to do is document the breaking change, document migration steps right here in the commit message, which I think is also pretty nice. And in our case, we're just going to type here, message changed from hello to welcome. And this is enough for our users to know, well, probably they don't have to change the API, but it's still, you know, it's a change in behavior. So we could argument that this is a breaking change after all. And let's commit this. And push this up to GitHub. And now we are going to, as soon as it's pushed, let's go to the repository already while we wait. Let's have a look what we did. As we can see now, we now have the release workflow here, which we can trigger manually through run workflow here. Let me just check real quick if our commit actually landed. 37 seconds ago, perfect, it actually did. So let's go to the action and trigger our first semantic release, and hopefully we will see that it works. Okay, the release was triggered. And we wait a little bit, it always needs some time to ramp up. Checking the stuff out, running npm CI, running the build. Still, we need to run the build again in order for us to create those index.js file that then semantic release is going to commit. We could also make the build step part of semantic release. Would also work. If you want to try it out, there's the semantic release exec plugin, which lets you execute any arbitrary shell command. But I try to keep the dependencies as little as possible, and the build step is so little that it doesn't matter. And we are done already. All me talking, I didn't realize we were done. As you can see, this is the output of semantic release. It loaded all the plugins. It kind of realized that there's already a git tag associated with this version. And it realized that we had a breaking change, so it's preparing, or it's also saying here that the next release is going to be version 2.0.0. And then it does all its magic and actually, well, finished successfully. Let's have a look what we created. First of all, what we are seeing here in our dist repository is that we have a new commit here with exactly this format that we've previously seen with char release 0.2.0.0 with the skip CI, so it contained our new file. We also see on the right side here that actually the version 2.0.0 was released as a release, and what we also see here is that we see that all the change logs, or the what's the name again? The logs of the changes, all those commits were associated in this change log here, which is super cool. You know, you didn't have to do anything to have this. And it also, this is really cool, links the commit, or if there was a pull request that introduced the change, it will link the pull request right here. So this is also a cool way of giving attributions to people that kind of did a pull request. And actually you are free to give Semantic Release a template here in how you want this release notes to look like. One little thing that you might realize, the marketplace is missing here. So the marketplace link, which usually indicates that this action was released to the marketplace, it's not there. And if we view our action on the marketplace now, you will realize that it still says version 1.0.0. This is a little drawback of a semantic release, and I think a drawback of GitHub in general, in that you cannot automatically release stuff to the marketplace, but you still always have to go by hand into the release and publish it again. And I think this is for legal reasons, as you know, you publish something to the website of GitHub. You always need to go here and then click again, update this release. Oh, it even needs my two-factor authentication. Great. In a demo is all we want to see, that two-factor authentication is working. So let's approve this on my cell phone real quick. And now we actually also published this version to the marketplace. So yeah, this is unfortunately still a little manual task that we have to do. But as I am releasing my actions manually anyways, for me, this is not such a big of a deal. One last thing, but I'm not going to put this in this video, but I encourage you to try it out for yourself. A best practice when releasing actions is not only to publish the tag with all three versions, but also have a tag like v2 and v2.0 for this case, or if you have version 1 and version 1.0, as those are shortcuts for those people that, you know, they don't care if there's a fixed release and they don't want the fixed version of your application, but they, you know, always want the newest of the non-breaking changes. For this, I created a Semantic Release plugin myself. It's called a Semantic Release GitHub Action Tags, and it will do exactly this for you. And as a little exercise for you to try yourself and get familiar with Semantic Release, I encourage you to just try to put this plugin into use and, well, you know, publish the additional tags which are best practices for GitHub Actions. And with this, I conclude this video series. We've learned how to create actions, we learned how to release them manually, and now we also learned how we can leverage Semantic Release to release them automatically. I hope you enjoyed those videos. I hope that you learned something. If you did, leave a like, subscribe my channel, and for sure I'm going to release some more videos around GitHub Actions and some best practices on releasing GitHub Actions. So stay tuned for this and have a great day and lots of fun with GitHub Actions. Goodbye.